Hello everybody and welcome to the Irwin Mitchell presentation today on elderly and loneliness for this Mental Health Awareness Week. A warm welcome to all of those who have joined. I know that there will be others who are going to join throughout the session also. If I may just begin with some housekeeping. You can submit some additional questions throughout the meeting if you would like via the Q&A function on your screen. If we don't get to those, then please do leave your email and contact addresses and details so that we can respond to those if we don't have time at the end of the session when there will be a Q&A. We have had some initial questions submitted which we will be dealing with in the first instance as we go through. The event is recorded and also will be available later on, but we will let you know. And about 15 minutes before the end of the session, there will be a link that shows up on the screen for your feedback. And if you would be kind enough to just take a couple of minutes to offer your feedback to us, we'd be very grateful. In which case, I'm just going to press on and welcome you then to us all. Brief introductions to the panel of presenters today. My name's Sophie Smith. I'm a solicitor at Irwin Mitchell in the Tax, Trust and Estates team, and I deal with lifetime planning, powers of attorney, registrations of enduring powers of attorney, deputyship applications, wills and probates with experience particularly in the elderly and vulnerable. Stuart Stretton-Hill is a senior associate also at Irwin Mitchell, also in the Tax, Trust and Estates team with an enormous wealth of experience in the elderly and vulnerable and all things from cradle to grave with the powers of attorney, wills, lifetime planning, probates, deputyship applications as well. Margaret Windram is an associate solicitor for Irwin Mitchell. She is in Wills, Tax, Trust and Estates Disputes team, which means that if Stuart or I have any difficulties or if there are certain situations where there are contentious issues or problems within family dynamics, then it's passed on to her and her team, who then run parallel with us while things are going on to sort out and resolve those problems. Margaret also has personal experience with elderly and vulnerable and people with various mental health issues, as she looks after a friend of hers under an attorneyship who has a diagnosis of dementia. She also has a brother who has a diagnosis of being bipolar. We'll come back to her and she'll tell us all about it. Morgan Vine, very welcome to you today. Morgan Vine is the head of policy at the charity Independent Age, who offers support to people who are over 65, offering a service of friendship, advisory services, social care and loneliness support, and rather excitingly has produced a mental health report which is published today. So I will let her speak briefly about that as well. Finally, very warm welcome to Maggie Cook, who has managed to overcome all the technical issues and has joined us today. Maggie is previously worked as a CEO in the NHS and is a clinical psychologist who runs her own business. Interestingly, very earlier this week, there was advice that if you all remember Captain Sir Tom Moore, who was the elderly gentleman who came to fame on his just before his 100th birthday, who decided to commit to walking 25 times around his garden 100 times to raise money for the NHS with a view to hitting his target of £1,000, but who magnanimously raised over £33 million. On the back of his fame and an enormous amount of work in his background, he's now setting up some podcasts where he speaks to a broad spectrum of people who have various issues, including the loneliness sections, which kind of brings us neatly into what we're talking about this week and hopefully we'll continue to talk about throughout the time. If I'm going to turn to Margaret first, if I may. Margaret, if you would like to tell us your story and share the experiences you've got on a personal level. Margaret.
Thank you, Sophie. As Sophie has explained, I am a solicitor and associate with Irwin Mitchell, but I'm really on this call because of my personal experiences of helping to support my friend Marjorie, who has a diagnosis of vascular dementia and was living alone. Fortunately, before she became unwell, she had set up an enduring power of attorney with me as her attorney to help her with her practical and financial issues. But obviously also I was able to help her with the emotional side and offering friendship in what can be a very lonely experience when your health is deteriorating and you're becoming more isolated and less able to do the things that you've always done. Also, my brother, who's not quite so elderly, he's in his late 50s, but he suffers from bipolar and also lives alone and also can feel quite isolated. Fortunately also as well, he has granted lasting powers of attorney to me, both in relation to property and finance, so that I can help him with the practical side, but also health and welfare to help with any medical decisions at times when he's unable to do so. Both of them experience situations of loneliness. I think we've all had situations probably in our lives where we have experienced loneliness. Perhaps we've moved to a new town and a new job, and it takes time to get to know people and to make friendships. But I think for the elderly who are perhaps experiencing a deterioration of health and perhaps friends are dying and loved ones are dying, and loneliness can seem endless and very daunting. So perhaps if I pass back to Sophie and we can talk more about those issues.
Yeah, and I think it's probably a good time to bring in Morgan in terms of what you experience and the people that come to, and the families indeed that come to you. You know, what are some of the main reasons that people in later life can feel depressed or anxious?
So I think it's a really important point to obviously start on loneliness. So there are currently over nearly 4 million people aged 65 and over living in the UK. And we know that many of those report feeling anxious and lonely, and lots of them get in touch with our organisation for ways that we can support them through our friendship service. And I think loneliness can be a real trigger towards somebody then feeling anxious or depressed. It's obviously not a given that that will happen, but it's certainly something that can result. There are also other triggers on top of loneliness which can decrease people's feelings of mental well-being. So for example, as Margaret said, bereavement is a huge one, and we've done some new research which showed that during COVID we think about 98,000 people have been bereaved of a partner during that time who are older people. So obviously a partner bereavement is a really significant impact on your life. It can impact your finances, your social life, your confidence. If that partner was providing care, if you live with a long-term condition, that's obviously enormous. So I think bereavement can be a real trigger. Other ones which I'm sure many of you will be aware of are things like living with long-term health conditions. So for people over 65, that is much more likely. 6 in 10 people over 60 live with a long-term condition. And again, to put this into COVID context, those of the shielding group, which was just over 2 million, nearly 1 million of that group were over 65 and were told to shield. So they have long-term conditions that are severe enough that they are now being told to not see anyone, and they're not able to maintain contacts and relationships. So again, loneliness has come to the fore. The only other thing to flag in terms of triggers that can really impact mental health that we hear about is the pressure on people who are unpaid family carers for loved ones. So those who have had to do that for somebody that is close to them will know of the immense pressure that can be on a family carer, whether that's helping with tasks like financial tasks or whether that's practical help and support. to do everyday activities. So all of those things are issues that people speak to Independent Age about that affect their mental health and can also increase their loneliness.
Yeah, and I guess with the pandemic that we've got, everything that's there suddenly has come to a fore and has been turned upside down, because the routines they relied upon and the means have been totally shattered, and they have to start again. Maggie, you know, how can you prevent loneliness in the elderly?
The key answer I'd want to convey here is one of prevention is better than cure. You know, the old adage is as true here as it is in so many other walks of life. And I realise that may be easier said than done, in particular, just bearing in mind something that Morgan has just shared with us, that 98,000 people bereaved of a partner during COVID. Actually, if one could have put in preventative strategies, one would have done, but we didn't expect a pandemic, and all of a sudden people are going to find themselves bereaved, isolated and lonely. So I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes reflecting on prevention being better than cure, and then come back to that really fundamental issue of what on earth does one do if you're suddenly thrust into living alone when you weren't expecting it, dealing with bereavement, and dealing with it in a period of isolation where potentially the person who was your main connector to the outside world has suddenly and abruptly been taken from you. Prevention being better than cure, actually establishing networks throughout our life, establishing connections throughout our life, keeping active, keeping engaged, are all really important preventative mechanisms in terms of loneliness. And in fact, when I'll come on to talk a bit later about how we can tell the difference between loneliness and, for example, a deterioration in cognitive functioning that may be part of dementia. Actually, again, staying engaged, staying connected with our world is really, really important. And it was a pleasure to meet Morgan in some of our preparation for this event and to learn of the work that Independent Age does. And in fact, I found myself having a conversation with one of my sister-in-laws where her mother has been connected to new friends through her GP service. And I thought, I wonder if that's a service that Morgan's providing, because it sounded very much like some of the things we were talking about. So where we can't prevent loneliness and we suddenly find ourselves thrust in a situation, or elderly clients of our professional colleagues and myself find themselves thrust into loneliness, then finding a way of creating those connections, however simple, however humble, helping to create some sort of friendship connection is really important, so that the individual has a sense of themselves not being an isolated island, but connected to others and getting a source of support and comfort from them. But I would want to go back to that theme of prevention being better than cure, and being forever mindful of what networks might we put in place. I kept saying to my son and daughter, I've got 23-year-old twins, and I kept saying to them before they left home, I'll do this when you've left home, I'll do that when you've left home. They said, Mum, do it now. And I'm really grateful to them for saying that. I established a great big network of singing, was singing around Europe and so on. And although at the moment I can't, and that's what I do when I'm not at work, and although at the moment I can't do that, that stayed as a connected community online. Now, I really struggle with it, singing on my own in my kitchen online. But the most humbling thought for me is that the eldest member of the choir is 95 and they've been a member of the choir for 73 years. That's a lovely example of establishing a connection that now is there. And many of us within the choir are in an older age bracket, but there are also a lot of university students and so on. Establish connections early on and they will support you into older age. But if you're thrust into loneliness in older age, then reach out for somebody, your GP, a professional, a neighbour who can help make connections for you. Those would be my key messages at this point.
Yeah, it's as you say, it's absolutely crucial that you can tap into whatever you've got local to you. I know that within we're based in the Gatwick area, and the local council has an enormous wealth of different avenues down which various people can go with whatever they're looking for. So I would certainly advise anybody to bear that in mind and go to your local health officer within your local council who will be able to signpost you onto a mass of assistance that there is out there. So that's really on a personal level. But Stuart, what about on a professional level and legal level? How can an elderly individual, legally protect themselves?
Thanks, Sophie. Yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, people are living on their own, they're elderly. Sadly, yes, they're absolutely at risk of financial abuse. It's not a new thing. I remember in my youth, my grandfather had a visitor at the door valuing silverware, and my grandfather handed over a lovely family heirloom silver salver, which of course we never saw again. And nowadays, financial abuse is just more sophisticated, people getting involved with individuals' lives, phone calls, online scams, all these sorts of things. So it is vital individuals do protect themselves legally. And the best way they can do that is to make a financial power of attorney far enough in advance. I'll echo Maggie's comments about prevention better than cure. You get a power of attorney in place. It's not just really for those lacking capacity. The attorney can keep an eye on the individual's finances from afar, and if they're keeping an eye on their bank statements and they can see large sums of money disappearing, or suddenly a regular standing order which looks a little bit suspicious, they can talk to the individual, the donor, the person who's made the power of attorney. So, well, what's that about? And then the attorney could take steps on their behalf to try and recover that money. So it's not about powers of attorney aren't about removing independence, it's about supporting the individual. And I think the most important thing when making a power of attorney is deciding who to appoint as your attorney. And hopefully, if you followed Maggie's advice, you surrounded yourself with friends, trusted individuals throughout your lifetime. You know people who you would trust 100% to look after your finances, to look after you when you may be lacking capacity or when you're living on your own. I absolutely would say that the vital thing is trust your attorney, because even though the attorney's primary duty is to act in the best interests of the individual, there are many cases where shockingly family members have drained the individual's finances, spending money on cars, expensive handbags, and even investing money in their own businesses. The most notable case was investing in a reptile farm that went bust. So I cannot stress enough that if you are appointing an attorney, it's got to be someone you trust. It's got to be someone who has the time to manage your finances. People often appoint their children, which is fine. But if that child has a hectic job, they're running their own company, or they've got their own children, have they got time to manage their own finances and manage yours and comply with the significant duties under the Mental Capacity Act? If you haven't got someone in your life who you trust or think won't have time to do all that for you, appoint a professional. It's better to have someone looking after you than no one at all. And our team runs a professional attorney service. We're independent. We can keep an eye. We know what we're doing. And I think it's very important for attorneys to understand that it's not a role to be taken on lightly. There are some significant duties with which they must comply. It is a very simple process to make a power of attorney online. The government website, you can log on there, you can draw up the power of attorney very easily. But that website does not give any guidance on additional powers, additional instructions, guidance, or things like that that you really must, I would say, is put that type of guidance, those type of instructions in the power of attorney. Firstly, and to make sure they're worded correctly, because the power of attorney must be registered with the Office of the Public Guardian before it can be used. And the Office of the Public Guardian is quite keen on rejecting powers of attorney where they don't like the wording. So get proper advice on the wording you're putting in. And secondly, making sure it's the right type of clauses, the right type of powers, so that the power of attorney will work in practice. And I'd say, given the level of power, the level of authority you're giving to an attorney, you're giving them complete access to your finances, to your home. Absolutely, you should take advice on that document. It's a very powerful legal document. And it's much cheaper to put in place a proper, well-worded, thought-out power of attorney than to deal with families warring down the line, or investigations by third parties, or the Office of Public Guardian trying to remove the attorney at a later date.
Yeah, absolutely critical information there. Margaret, in terms of your practical experience, then you say that you had an enduring power of attorney, which we know is the historic version of the lasting power of attorney, but perfectly valid still. You know, how have you found, both on a legal standpoint and professional standpoint, and as a friend as well, to support your friend? How has that worked?
Well, it was quite difficult to, because as Marjorie was losing capacity under the enduring power of attorney legislation, I then had to get an opinion from the GP as to whether she was losing capacity to manage her finances. And then once I had that, I then had to serve notice on her that I was registering it with the Office of the Public Guardian to be then able to continue using the power of attorney to help her with her finances. And understandably, she was a bit cross, really, that I was saying that she was starting to lose capacity, because, you know, she'd always managed her finances very well all the way along. But I knew that she was vulnerable to potentially the people coming to the door and saying, well, don't you remember we did the roof on your house last week and you owe us money? She wouldn't, if she thought she owed anybody money, she would have paid, you know, she would have paid whatever she'd been asked for. So that was quite difficult on a personal level, because she was my friend. Obviously, it would have been easier if we had simply had a professional connection, but because she's my friend, you know, that was a bit difficult. But she needed that protection to be in place, and she needed me to help her with things. And because she was losing capacity, I had to step in and register and carry on helping her once it was registered. But in terms of you know, offering help to people, I think we as individuals need to look around us in our communities, and particularly elderly friends who might be vulnerable, to, you know, think about what they might need and how we might be able to help them if they're experiencing loneliness, or if they're experiencing difficulties in dealing with things that in the past they'd have had no problem dealing with. So it's about also being respectful, because obviously in the same way that Marjorie was, you know, was a very capable lady before she started to lose capacity, we need to be respectful and tactful in the way that we offer friendship. And it doesn't have to be big things to begin with, but it's reaching out the hand of friendship to people who are perhaps feeling lonely. And with Marjorie and with my brother, it's all about involving them in family life, which is really important for people who are on their own, to be fully involved in the day-to-day of family life and fully included within things, you know, if that's what they want and when they want to do that. And obviously it was really lovely for us as well to have Marjorie as an extra grandparent effectively, and she was very good with the children, talking to them about the war, and when she was seeing the aeroplanes going overhead and things, and that really was lovely for us and the children. So we benefit as well a lot as individuals from our connections with the elderly, and benefiting from their experience, as well as then those connections helping to alleviate the worst of loneliness that can be devastating for people. Obviously at the moment with COVID, it's a lot more difficult. People who are feeling vulnerable or shielding, it's quite difficult for them to come into a family home in the way that they would have done before. And my brother, who has bipolar, is very wary of contact with people who might have come into contact with the virus. So although he would be able to be in a bubble with us, he's quite wary of that. So although I obviously go round and see him, we talk in the garden, and I take his shopping, but he's not going out and he's not coming to the family home, our family home, in the way that he would have previously. So during this time, where I'm sure there were millions of people across the country who are feeling very similar, we need to find ways to carry on offering that friendship. So I speak to my brother on the telephone at least once every day, and most of the time I'm the only person that he speaks to during the day. So that's really important, but also sending little messages and keeping in contact in other ways, like taking food round, you know, that you've cooked, you know, you've perhaps bake an extra bit of apple crumble or whatever it is and take that round, or take some flowers or send some flowers if you've got elderly relatives or friends that are perhaps a bit more distant away or not wanting to come into contact face to face. It just shows and keeps those, and also obviously for those who are online, Zoom contacts, at least you see the person, which and you can see their smile. Yeah, I think that's really important for people. So perhaps I can pass on to back to Sophie for the next question.
Yeah, and it's interesting, and it's very difficult. There's a very fine line, isn't there, between the feeling of loneliness and perhaps there being something a bit more ominous and of concern. Maggie, you know, when is loneliness no longer loneliness and might just tip into depression or other? How does one deal with that?
It's a really important question, Sophie, and to be honest, it can often be quite difficult to tell the difference. And often, you know, I have conversations about depression several times a day, most days of the week, and often the concept one has in one's mind is of somebody who's sitting in a corner in tears all of the time. Actually, that often isn't the first sign of depression, and many of the signs of depression overlap with the withdrawal that comes with loneliness, or the withdrawal that comes with cognitive impairment, with cognitive deterioration, when one's losing a degree of control of one's, you know, kind of faculties. And I mean, I'll come on to that in questions later, the issue around, you know, potential issues around deterioration in cognitive functioning. But with depression, fundamentally, there's a question of degree here. And what I often say, if people say, you know, how do I know if I need to see a clinical psychologist versus a counsellor versus befriend someone? And I would say it's a question of degree. To what extent is something interfering with your functioning on a day-to-day basis? And so as professionals or as colleagues or as friends, when we have friends or clients who are elderly, and this would be true of anybody indeed, how do we tell if they're getting depressed? Crucially, it will be that sense that there's a deterioration in particular in things like self-care, perhaps. It may be a deterioration in concentration, in memory. And again, here comes, you know, some of the challenge in differentiating between this and cognitive impairment. Withdrawal. Somebody may well lose weight. You might think that they're physically unwell. They may lose weight. They may look really tired because they'll have problems with sleep. And the crucial kind of early signs of depression are a loss of appetite, fragmented sleep. Often it's not necessarily a case of difficulty getting off to sleep, although it can be, but it's waking early. And if you're chatting with somebody and they talk about sleep problems and they're typically waking at 2 in the morning, and then they'll have a fragmented sleep pattern all the way through the night, that's a really important hallmark. Or if they're showing a lack of appetite and they've really lost interest in food and you were taking around the apple crumble and they really weren't interested, then and you knew that they'd really liked that before, then it can start a question mark. Or if you've seen that they're wearing the same clothes that they've worn the last 3 times that you've seen them, it's just signs that somebody's paying less care and attention, signs of withdrawal. And really the same kind of approach is crucial. We talked about making connections, haven't we, in our conversations so far? And if we discern a sense that somebody's depressed, again, it's really important to find a way of reaching out. But Margaret's made, I think, a really fundamentally important point here. It's about also doing that in a respectful way. You know, ultimately, potentially, that person needs to see their general practitioner, but helping them to make that decision when they may be a very determined, very stoical person, and we can become more determined in stoicism if we're lonely and withdrawn because we get stuck in that bubble. So finding a way in may just simply involve sitting and having a conversation, but making sure that you pop back for another conversation the next day rather than the next week. And so that you can keep building on that engagement and get more of a sense of the extent to which they're withdrawn, the extent to which their sleep is really impacted. And you'll get more of a sense of their mood, a lowness, a flatness in terms of their mood. And some of the content of what they say is going to be important. And if you discern a lack of a sense of purpose, that they're feeling that things are futile, a sense of hopelessness, those are really, really key indicators of depression. And I would venture to suggest start to differentiate between depression and loneliness. Perhaps if I may just make a connecting point to something that Morgan said earlier, Sophie, if I've still got time to add, you know, just thinking about the figures that you were quoting, Morgan, in relation to people who've suddenly been bereaved. I think it's important to note that everything that I've just described can also be true in bereavement. So not only can it be really hard to tell the difference between loneliness and depression unless we can really get to know somebody better or find a way of reaching in, it's also true with depression, with grief. And grief can sometimes lead to depression, but it doesn't always. But again, the same theme applies, actually finding a way of helping that person to connect. And in particular, with sudden grief, sudden unexpected loss, crucial to help that person have someone to talk with, talk about how they feel, talk about what they're missing, and as well help them talk about really practical things. You know, the number of times I spend in consultations with some of my more elderly clients, actually talking about washing machines and tumble dryers, and just thinking about what Margaret was saying earlier about getting, and Stuart, about getting enduring power of attorney in early. At one point, 3 of the 4 of my then elderly relatives, we had powers of attorney in place for them. I hold the kind of health and welfare power of attorney for one of my aunts jointly with my medic brother, and we've had financial powers of attorney in place as well. And you know, crucially, these discussions around those sorts of themes can also be a way of getting involved and getting engaged and discerning if somebody's depressed. They can be a way of discerning the impact of their grief, and starting the conversations and exploring with them what kind of connections are going to be important to put in place.
Yeah, so it's that time of the opportune moment to seek help and or offer help. Morgan, you know, what are some of the barriers that exist which perhaps might stop people in later life reaching out and receiving mental health support?
So in our Mind That Matters report, which, as you mentioned, Sophie, we've released today, it includes the findings of a survey of about 3,000 people in later life, and we talked to them about the barriers they've experienced to accessing support. So some of that is their own barriers. So they've grown up in households where it was not okay to speak about your mental health. You were encouraged to just get on with it. There wasn't a lot of support out there, even if you did want to talk about it. So for a lot of people, they just don't think anything can be done. And really sadly, of the polling that we did, 1 in 4 people of all ages thought that mental health problems were a natural part of growing older, which we know is not the case, and people can recover from anxiety and depression and can be treated for it. Other barriers include things like thinking it's a private matter or only wanting to share it with friends and family. So that can be quite important when people feel like they don't want to bother their GP or it's not important enough to go to a doctor. For those who did go to a medical professional, we had a really mixed bag. Many people said how brilliant their doctor was, and they were given lots of treatment options, and they were told, you know, this was serious and signposted to support. but others shared that they were basically told this is a normal part of aging. No wonder you are feeling low or depressed. You know, go home and get on with your life, essentially. And again, we just don't want that to be the case. We think that people in later life should have access to treatment options the same as anyone of any other age, because nobody should be living with anxiety and depression for longer than they need to. And just to pick up on one thing that Maggie said, she's absolutely right. With bereavement sadly is a part of life, and many people will go through the grieving process in a really natural way, and they will come out the other side and, you know, be able to get back to life. But when bereavement happens in a way that is fragmented, so for example, you might not have known the death was coming, you don't feel prepared, you might have had multiple bereavements in one go, you might feel like you weren't able to be with your loved one at the end of their life, and you don't know if they had a good end of life. All of those things can compound into something called complex grief, and for that you often do need counselling, because it can basically give you sort of PTSD symptoms. And of the 98,000 figure that I mentioned earlier, we think about 6,000 or 7,000 will be experiencing complex grief, because COVID, all of the things I've just said that can make complex grief happen, COVID has made happen. You know, people aren't going to funerals, they don't know what's coming down the track. So we're really concerned about the fact that there are reasons and barriers which prevent people from seeking support at the moment, whether they're held by themselves or whether it's something that society's put on them. So we need to make sure we push down those barriers and get people the support they need.
Yeah, it's critical, isn't it? Stuart, then from your perspective, in terms of the fact that it's possible or unlikely that the people who might bring this to the fore are going to be family members or deputies and attorneys, you know, what is needed by a deputy or an attorney to be a good deputy or an attorney? Sure.
I think it's three things: compassion, understanding, and being alert. Those are the three major things. As Maggie said, spotting issues arising is very, very important. And as a health and welfare attorney, you know, if you are concerned about the donor of the power of attorney or the person under your charge, speak to the GP. You have the authority to do that. If you're unhappy with what the GP is saying, as Morgan said, if the GP is unable to provide the necessary support, speak to other organisations. So it's really about having a complete understanding of the individual's personal circumstances and about their financial circumstances. Margaret said how involved she is in her brother's life. It's so important. You cannot dip in and out of being an attorney. It is something you are. It's like being a parent. You can't one day decide, I just don't want to do it, without making proper arrangements. You've got to have, attorneys have got to have an absolute knowledge of their duties under the Mental Capacity Act and what they can and what they can't do. And they've got to abide by the principles of the Act. One of the greatest pieces of advice I'll give to attorneys is read the Mental Capacity Act Code of Practice. It's a document that's freely available online. It is a long document. It is something, though, you can dip in and out of. And sadly, most attorneys don't know the Mental Capacity Code of Practice even exists, and yet it's a really, really useful document because it sets out the principles in the Act. Attorneys cannot just assume an individual doesn't have capacity. They must support the individual to make decisions. Just because the individual wants to make an unwise decision doesn't necessarily mean they lack capacity. Attorneys must also act in the individual's best interests at all time. And they must take decisions in the least restrictive manner possible. So there's some quite important principles by which attorneys must abide. So they really need to understand and appreciate those principles. They must also understand their restrictions under the Act. The place where attorneys most often trip up is making gifts or making payments on behalf of the individual. Attorneys and deputies have limited powers to make gifts, and they can't act where they're conflicted, so they shouldn't make gifts to themselves. But what slips through the net is understanding what a gift might be. Obviously buying a present or giving money, that's clear, but writing off a loan could be a gift. Allowing someone to live in the individual's house rent-free could also be a gift. Making a loan to someone but not charging interest, or making payments on behalf of someone else. For example, grandparents often pay school fees. if an attorney carries on paying those school fees, they are basically making a gift. And we had this issue on a case we dealt with. It was very unfortunate. We had two brothers were executors of their mother's will. One of the brothers had acted as attorney during mother's lifetime. She had paid his children's, the attorney's children's school fees throughout her life. She lost capacity. She moved into care. He was acting as her attorney. He just carried on paying those school fees because it's what grandma would have wanted to do. The problem was when and what he had to do in order to keep on paying the school fees and to keep paying for care was to sell mum's house. And the major issue was when mum died, she had actually left the house to the grandchildren under her will. So you had there a situation where you've got grandchildren under the will expecting to get a property, saying to their dad, well, you know, where's it gone? He said, well, I had to sell it to pay your school fees. The brother, acting as executor, now has a duty on behalf of those children, on behalf of those beneficiaries, essentially to sue the attorney, to say, you know, you acted outside of your authority. You should not have been making those gifts. It was not in mum's best interests, and it was essentially to yourself, so you're acting in a conflict. So there you've got a family situation of brother against brother, children against father. Fortunately, in that case, we were able to negotiate a settlement, but it almost rips a family apart just because the attorney didn't understand their duties. If they had understood what they were doing, if they were aware of their legal issues, they could have gone to the Court of Protection, they could have got approval for paying those school fees, and approval of the way they were managing mum's finances. And I spend a lot of time educating attorneys and deputies on their duties, on their responsibilities. We've developed some specific sort of legal services to help attorneys understand what they should and shouldn't be doing. We also bring applications to the Court of Protection to get authority to make gifts, to change wills where appropriate. So I think that the key thing, as I say, is attorneys need to understand what they do, but they've got to do it in a compassionate way. As Maggie and Margaret said, you know, you're becoming very involved in someone's life. You need to understand their wishes. Don't just run roughshod. It's not an open checkbook. You've got to do it with cooperation and understanding.
It is. It's a minefield, isn't it? And it's not through. It's not through necessarily somebody being deliberately difficult or underhand. It's just things that you don't ask yourselves, and unfortunately, as you say, Stuart, it's something that we all see all too often. It does focus on the financial element, but coming back then perhaps to the health and well-being and of an individual. Margaret, you know, in terms of your personal experience with both your brother and your friend, is, you know, what does that kind of concern and pressure and loneliness and difficulty in having to discuss these scenarios with them have on their own mental well-being and their health, and how do you deal with that aspect?
Well, I think the effect of loneliness on health and well-being and happiness of the person is very profound, and it can have a huge, almost physical effect as well on the person. And obviously Maggie's talked about when loneliness sort of slides into depression and the huge impact that can have on people. And it's really about getting alongside the elderly person and trying to understand what's going on and trying to make those connections and get the help that's needed for them if they need greater help than you're able to give as a friend. If they need medical help, you know, obviously dealing with it tactfully and respectfully, as we've talked about before, and not sort of, you know, not being part of the problem in effect by sort of pushing them into something that they're not happy with, but gently moving them towards the help that they need. Obviously, also there are other areas of support that we've talked about, and that Morgan's organisation, you know, has talked about as well and can offer. And also the local authority has the details of other organisations that can help. And you know, I think we've all experienced, as we talked about before, we've all experienced loneliness in our lives, and I think we can have some understanding of how that feels for people. And I think we just need to do the best that we can to help and use our connections to look out for people and to help them through those situations.
Morgan, then from your perspective of somebody who provides a lot of this support and signpost people in other directions, you know, what do you hear from those people in later life about their own experiences in accessing the support that they can have for mental health issues and dementias?
Yeah. So the research that we've just done, in that 3/4 of people said that since turning 65 they'd experienced severe low mood or anxiety. So we were quite shocked by that's such a high number of people. We know from the people that we've spoken to and national data that talking therapy is something that is really responded to well by people in later life, and they really get a lot of value from it and they find it very effective. However, we also know that they're more likely to be on medication. Now, when bearing in mind that people in later life often live with long-term conditions, many have said to us they don't want to add another pill to the pills that they're already taking, and if there are another option to support their mental health and well-being, they would take it. However, our new research showed that nearly half of people over 65 didn't know that you could access things like talking therapy through the NHS. So that's obviously really shocking and something that needs to be improved quickly. We also know that for those who do access talking therapy, so that could be something like group therapy, CBT, something like that, that there are often really long waiting lists. So even if they've overcome all the barriers and then been referred to talking therapy, they can sometimes wait 10 months, 11 months, people have told us. Now, when you're in a mental health crisis or you are feeling low or depressed, that's an incredibly long time. So some people have shared with us that they had the option, they paid, so they went private, but not everyone has that option. You know, not everyone has the funds to do that. So again, it's really, really important that the talking therapy sector and the NHS is recruiting people who can deliver this treatment to people in later life and those of other ages. The only other thing to say is that people have shared with us is sometimes when they receive some sort of talking therapy or group therapy or mindfulness sessions, they felt like these were cut off too early. You know, they might only have been given 2 or 3 sessions, which isn't really long enough for them to process and deal with or learn new techniques and tactics to help preserve and boost their mental health. So I think we definitely would want to make sure that people were receiving mental health support for longer, if that's possible. So yeah, they're some of the main things.
Yeah, Maggie, then on the back of that, you know, what can we do to help in terms of knowing that they're often the signposts that are out there are limited within a certain time frame or financially limited with what the social services might be able to offer? You know, what can we do to help?
It would help if I put my microphone on, I've just realised, so forgive me. It's a really, to be honest, I think that's a really, really tricky question, and it is my initial response. And it's, in many ways, what we can do to help, the short answer is we've covered a lot of that in our discussion. We've been talking about helping people stay connected. We've been talking about helping them reach out for help. And actually, Margaret has, talked about that fundamental issue of doing that in a really respectful way. And thinking about the research that Morgan's organisation has just published, I find myself on the one hand shocked, and then when I think, well, actually, no, I'm not really shocked. If I do a straw poll of my clients, I work solely privately now. I worked for most of my career in the NHS prior to going privately, and those are the stories that I am told now, and they were the stories that I was told then. So what can we do? We can help people connect. We can help them with those conversations with their GPs. We can help run through what will they say with the GP. It's part of reaching out and befriending. We can help them. I often will go through GP surgery websites with people, looking at the signs that which GP will perhaps be best disposed to work with mental health issues, and often that's up there, up front, but wouldn't necessarily be what we would think about to do. And we can help work out whether can they take a friend, can they take an advocate, is there a family member who can go with them to the GP to help them find their voice in that situation. I guess the other thing is as well, potentially recognising that if the service that they're able to access ultimately through the NHS is both time limited and they will have a long wait, what else can they access in the meantime? And ensuring that they are making best use of the service from their GP and tapping into what what may well be there in terms of the independent sector and services provided by organisations such as Morgan's and other colleagues in the voluntary and non-governmental sector. If I may also, if I could just add as a couple of almost side notes, but really important ones, we've touched on themes around grief, we've touched on themes around depression, and Morgan mentioned complex grief. And actually that isn't officially yet part of the diagnostic manual that informs the funding streams that go into the NHS. And I decided to look up when it was going to be part of the formal, because I use it in my reports a lot. And I say I recognise it's not part of the formal diagnostic kind of machinery, and it will be in place in 2022. So I'm treating people with complex grief. Morgan's organisation is working with people with complex grief. I have no doubt, Stuart, that you find that in your work as an attorney, and yet it's not an official diagnosis. And I anticipate that we will see much more of that as we'll see a growth in post-traumatic stress disorder that will come from individuals who have had COVID-19 and have been in ITU. We'll see it in their family members who've been on the sidelines and watched. And as professionals, finding a way of helping people to acknowledge that those are real issues, even if they're not in the diagnostic manuals and we can't officially be diagnosed with it, finding a way of reaching in and supporting people on their journey to getting healthcare is really important.
Absolutely. And Margaret, then, with that in mind, how can professionals learn, and you've got your dual hat on here, but how can professionals learn how to support those people with these various issues and complex issues?
Well, I think the professional to understand the whole situation that the person's facing in order to point them in the right direction for the help that they need. I found it quite helpful at one stage when my brother was in hospital, that I was pointed to the carers group, because although I didn't need help emotionally as a carer, I was struggling to find the right person to talk to about what I saw as failings in the care that my brother was receiving. And the carers support group was really helpful in pointing me to the right person at the hospital, which was a long way away, as to who I needed to talk to get the problems sorted out. But some carers are exhausted after months or years of caring, and they also need emotional support as well as the elderly person or the vulnerable person that they're caring for. So the carer support group can be very helpful, and the local authority has an obligation to provide that support for the carers as well as for the individual. And obviously if the carer isn't coping very well, that doesn't help the elderly person or the vulnerable person who needs their full help and support. I also, from helping Marjorie, when she went into hospital and then had to go into a care home after being in hospital, and she felt very trapped when she was in the care home because due to her increasing dementia, she wasn't able to go out on her own because she was a risk to herself. And so there was a deprivation of liberty assessment. As part of that, I was able to put in place other carers to take her out when I wasn't around, to be able to do so when I was at work and things like that. And also, if if the weather wasn't good, they would be able to sit with her and talk to her and play games with her or do whatever she wanted. And that was really another thing that's useful for professionals to remember, that even if someone's in a care home, often the carers there are too busy to provide the one-on-one support that people need. And that was really helpful in alleviating, because it's a long day in the care home until I was able to visit in the evening, or on weekends and things. And I think in the same way for elderly people, vulnerable people who are stuck at home, a day is a long day if you're any people that you're going to be able to see can't come until later, or you don't have anyone that's going to be visiting or able to visit. So putting in place those carers to do sort of the practical things can also be helpful if there's the money available to pay for that. So that was one thing, and also obviously remembering all of the organisations that can provide the support that the person needs. The non-governmental organisations such as Morgan's organisation, but also the local authority can signpost to all the sources of support for the person, to work alongside the legal steps that can be put in place, such as the powers of attorney, etc.
Thanks, Margaret. Stuart, then, final words from you. We've got 3 minutes left. I'm mindful that we're coming to the end, so briefly, if you wouldn't mind, Stuart, in terms of potential failings or concerns, how can those who support and assist these vulnerable people, how can they be best prepared?
Sure. Well, I sort of said it all the way through. I mean, it's get legal advice. I mean, that might seem rather self-serving. You and I would very happily provide that advice, but it is absolutely understanding your duties in terms of protecting individuals. Yes, speak to local authority if you have concerns about an individual being financially abused. You must, as an attorney, or even indeed a concerned third party, you must absolutely let the local authority adult services team know. They will do an investigation. If you're really concerned that money has been taken, as an attorney, don't be afraid to let the police know. We have involved police in cases where we think attorneys and third parties have been financially abusing individuals and essentially stealing money from them. Most importantly, though, I'd say go to the individual themselves. You're acting as their attorney. You need to understand what they want you to do. What are their wishes? Speak to them in the context of understanding your own legal duties, your own legal authority. Important as well, I'd say, get an understanding of the individual's illness. If they are living with dementia, understand what living with dementia means. I mean, I act as a dementia friend champion, so I train up individuals to be dementia friends, which is providing a lot of help and support for those individuals to understand what living with dementia is all about and to help people with dementia live better lives. So I suppose in short, it's three things: understanding the individual, go to them, speak to them, understand their needs, speak to their friends, speak to their family, speak to the care home. If you're worried about financial abuse, speak to the local authority, speak to the police, and speak to us. Get legal advice on what you can and what you can't do.
Thank you, and thank you very much indeed for everybody who's joined us and for your questions that you've uploaded. We will get to them and answer you personally after this session, which, as I said, has been recorded. So do feel free to view it in your own time. My very great thanks to both Maggie and Morgan for your professional insight and huge knowledge on these aspects, and of course to my colleagues Stuart and Margaret. Please do, if you can, take time to put your comments on our feedback page. And once again, thank you very much indeed for joining us here. The final slide you'll see on the screen there are, for the rest of the week, the upcoming webinars that Irwin Mitchell are hosting. By all means, please do click on the links to join those sessions. You are really most welcome. Thank you so much again, everybody. See you soon.